December 21st, 1944. 6:27 in the morning. Malmedy, Belgium. Private First Class. Francis Sherman Curry crouched behind a shattered doorway in a ruined factory, bazooka in his frost-burned hands, and watched death roll toward him on steel treads. The Panzer Mark V was less than 30 yards away now, close enough to hear the squeal of its drive wheels, close enough to smell the diesel exhaust mixing with snow and cordite. Behind Curry, 5 wounded Americans lay trapped under collapsed masonry, unable to move, unable to run, and in that frozen moment, with his finger resting on the trigger, the 19-year-old automatic rifleman made a calculation that had nothing to do with survival. He positioned himself at what any tactician would call a suicidal angle. Too close to escape, too exposed to survive, with no cover and no retreat. Then he realized something that changed everything. If he ran, they all died. Before we dive in, hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. It's incredible to think people are watching this from Tokyo, Berlin, Mumbai, all over the world, all connected by these stories. Now let's get back to December 1944. The German offensive that would become the Battle of the Bulge began 5 days earlier. Over 200,000 German troops, supported by 1,400 tanks and assault guns, surged through the snow-choked Ardennes forest. The Americans were caught completely unprepared. By December 21st, the Bulge had pushed 40 miles into Allied lines, and near the town of Malmedy, on the northern shoulder of that Bulge, the 30th Infantry Division, nicknamed Old Hickory, was all that stood between German Panzers and a clear road to the Meuse River. Francis Sherman Curry had been in Europe since June 1944. Born on June 29, 1925 in Loch Sheldrake, New York, he'd lost his father at 12 and grown up fast. He tried to enlist at 17, got turned away, then joined the day he turned 18. By December, he was a combat veteran with Company K, 3rd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment. He'd fought through France, the Netherlands, and into Germany itself. But nothing had prepared him for this morning. The German attack came with overwhelming force. Tank destroyers were overrun in minutes. Anti-tank guns knocked out before their crews could traverse barrels. Curry's platoon was forced back into a bombed-out factory near a critical bridge. During the withdrawal, part of the roof collapsed under artillery fire. 5 American soldiers went down under the rubble, pinned, wounded, unable to extract themselves. Curry looked around the ruined factory. The other men had pulled back to secondary positions. Radio communication was dead. Nobody was coming to help. The wounded men behind him were calling out, panicked, knowing what happened to soldiers who couldn't move when tanks rolled through. Then Curry saw something in the debris. A bazooka, just sitting there against a wall where someone had dropped it during the retreat. The rockets were across the street in a knocked-out half-track. To get them, Curry would have to cross open ground under direct observation from German infantry, who had taken positions in a house 50 yards away. He didn't hesitate. He slung his Browning automatic rifle across his back and ran. German machine gun fire erupted immediately. Tracers snapped past his head, kicked up frozen mud at his feet, sparked off metal debris. He dove behind the half-track, grabbed an armful of rockets, and sprinted back to the factory. Bullets chewed through the doorframe as he threw himself inside. Now came the calculation. Standard doctrine called for firing from concealment at maximum range, then displacing immediately. But the bridge behind Curry was a bottleneck that forced German armor to bunch up. If he positioned too far back, he'd lose the angle. If he fired from inside the building, the backblast would kill everyone. So he moved to the suicidal angle, a position just inside the blown-out factory wall, close enough to hit the tanks where their side armor was weakest, with no room to retreat if things went wrong. The lead Panzer was 20 yards away when Curry stood up, shouldered the bazooka, and fired. The rocket streaked across the gap in a trail of white smoke and slammed into the tank's flank just below the turret ring. The explosion was enormous. Fire erupted from the engine compartment. The turret hatch flew open and German crew members bailed out, some burning. The tank ground to a halt, blocking the narrow approach, but there were more tanks behind it. Curry dropped the bazooka, grabbed his bar, and poured 20 rounds into German infantry trying to flank his position. 3 went down. The others scattered. Then he saw the problem. A second Panzer was maneuvering around the burning wreck. This is where most soldiers would have fallen back. Curry had done his job, knocked out 1 tank, bought some time. But the 5 wounded men were still pinned inside the factory, and if that second tank got through, they were dead. So Curry ran across the street again. German rifles opened up immediately. A bullet grazed his neck, close enough to draw blood but not deep enough to stop him. He grabbed a second rocket, loaded it, and set up behind a pile of rubble even closer to the German position than before. The mathematics of courage are simple. Every time you expose yourself, the odds of survival decrease. Curry was now on his 3rd exposure in less than 10 minutes. But he wasn't calculating survival anymore. He was calculating time. How many minutes could he buy for those 5 men? The second Panzer came around the burning hulk. Curry let it come closer, until he could see the tactical markings on the turret. Then he fired. Direct hit on the track assembly. The tank slewed sideways, through a track, and ground to a stop. Not destroyed, but immobilized, blocking the road even more effectively. Now the German infantry knew exactly where he was. Concentrated fire began raking his position from the occupied house. Curry counted 3 distinct machine gun positions in the windows. He couldn't stay where he was. But he also couldn't leave. So he did something that made no tactical sense. He went on the attack. Grabbing his bar, Curry advanced directly toward the German-held house. Alone, in full view, firing from the hip as he moved. 3 German soldiers appeared in the doorway, shocked to see a lone American charging straight at them. Curry cut them down with a sustained burst from 30 yards out. Then he positioned himself 50 yards from the house and waved back toward the factory for covering fire. The house needed to be destroyed completely if the trapped Americans were going to have any chance. So Curry stood up, fully exposed to whatever Germans were still inside, and fired a bazooka rocket directly at the building. The blast knocked down half of one wall. German infantry scrambled out of the collapsing structure. That's when Curry saw them. 5 more American soldiers pinned down between the factory and the German positions, unable to move because of crossfire from the house, and 3 additional German tanks that had arrived from the south. They'd been there for hours, trapped, certain they were going to die. Curry made the calculation instantly. They couldn't move until those tanks were dealt with. He ran back to the disabled half-track, loaded up with anti-tank grenades, and ran toward the 3 tanks. German fire intensified. They knew what he was doing and were determined to stop him. Bullets tore through the half-track's thin armor as Curry grabbed an armful of grenades. The grenades weren't powerful enough to destroy a Panzer, but they were loud, created smoke, and convinced the tank commanders they were under serious attack. 2 crews buttoned up, closing their hatches, limiting visibility. The 3rd tank began reversing. Curry lobbed the grenades with desperate accuracy. One burst near the lead tank's tracks. Another hit the road wheel of the 2nd tank. But Curry wasn't done. He climbed onto the disabled American half-track, in full view of every German gun, and manned the .50 caliber machine gun mounted on the vehicle. The big weapon had a range of over a mile and fired rounds powerful enough to penetrate light armor. Curry opened fire on the house, raking windows and doorways. Sustained, devastating fire. Under that covering barrage, the 5 trapped Americans finally managed to move. They crawled, ran, dragged each other toward safer positions. 2 were wounded. All should have been dead. But Curry had bought them the minutes they needed. Then he shifted targets. Another American machine gun position nearby had lost its crew to German fire. Curry abandoned the .50 cal, ran to the 2nd position, and took over that gun. He fired until the Germans pulled back, until the immediate threat had been neutralized, until the bridge remained in American hands. By the time the engagement ended, somewhere around 9:30 in the morning, Francis Curry had been fighting continuously for over 3 hours. He had personally destroyed or disabled multiple German tanks. He had killed or wounded an unknown number of enemy infantry. He had rescued 5 American soldiers who would have otherwise died. And he had held a critical bridge that prevented German armor from exploiting a breakthrough. When American reinforcements arrived later that morning, they found the road choked with destroyed vehicles and scattered equipment. The German offensive in that sector had been stopped cold. Intelligence officers later determined that the Panzer column Curry engaged was part of a larger force attempting to reach Liège and threaten the entire northern flank of the American position. One 19-year-old private with a bazooka had disrupted a division-level operation. But here's what makes the story remarkable. When his commanding officers debriefed him, when they asked why he'd taken such incredible risks, his answer was simple. He just did what needed to be done. No bravado, no attempt to glorify his actions. He saw men who needed help and acted. The formal recognition came 7 months later. On July 27, 1945, President Harry S. Truman awarded Francis Sherman Curry the Medal of Honor. The citation noted Curry's conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. He was 20 years old, one of the youngest Medal of Honor recipients from World War II, but if you'd met him afterward, you never would have known it. He didn't talk about the war much. He didn't seek attention or capitalize on his fame. Instead, he went home to New York, took a job with the Department of Veterans Affairs, and spent 30 years helping other veterans navigate the challenges of coming home. The irony is profound. The man who held off a Panzer advance spent the rest of his working life pushing papers, helping soldiers get the benefits they'd earned. No parades, no book deals, no attempt to make himself into a legend. Just quiet service, day after day, in offices where nobody cared that the guy helping with your disability claim once destroyed multiple German tanks in a single morning. In 2009, the post office in Hurleyville, New York, was renamed the Francis S. Curry Post Office. A statue was erected in Cazenovia Park in Buffalo, depicting him firing the bazooka that morning in Belgium. Bronze captured in mid-action, forever frozen in the suicidal angle. But the real monument to Francis Curry isn't bronze or marble. It's the men he saved. 5 soldiers who went home to families, who had children, who grew old in a world that almost ended for them on a frozen December morning in 1944. It's the bridge that remained in American hands, the German offensive that stalled, the weeks bought for Allied armies to regroup. The Battle of the Bulge would rage for another month. By January 25, 1945, the German offensive had been completely defeated. Hitler's last gamble had failed, and through all of that, in 1,000 small engagements that never made the history books, ordinary soldiers made the same choices Francis Curry made. They stayed when they could have run. They held the line. But Curry's story stands out not just for what he did, but for how he lived afterward. In an age that worships celebrity, Francis Curry chose substance. He could have leveraged his Medal of Honor into speaking tours, television appearances, political office. Instead, he showed up for work every day and helped veterans fill out paperwork. That's the real lesson. True heroism doesn't need an audience. Francis Sherman Curry died on October 8, 2019, at the age of 94. By then, he was one of the last surviving Medal of Honor recipients from World War II. But the people who really knew him, the veterans he'd helped at the VA, the neighbors who'd lived next to him, they remembered something different. They remembered a kind man who never raised his voice, who never bragged, who carried himself with quiet dignity. In the end, the suicidal angle wasn't just a position on a battlefield. It was a metaphor for every moment when the easy path and the right path diverge. When survival instinct says run, but conscience says stay. Francis Curry stood in that angle for 3 hours on December 21, 1944. But in a larger sense, he lived in that angle for the rest of his life, choosing service over celebrity, substance over glory, duty without recognition. That morning in Malmedy, when Curry crouched behind that factory wall and calculated his chances, he understood something fundamental. The mathematics of courage have nothing to do with odds of success. They have everything to do with what needs to be done. 5 men needed saving. A bridge needed holding. The line needed someone to stand in it. So he stood. This is what separates stories like this from fiction. Francis Curry wasn't chosen by destiny, wasn't gifted with supernatural abilities, wasn't protected by plot armor. He was 19 years old, cold, scared, and fully aware he would probably die in the next 10 minutes. And he did it anyway. Not because he expected to survive, not because he wanted recognition, but because someone had to choose the suicidal angle. The bridge still stands in Malmedy. Traffic crosses it every day. Nobody thinks about what happened there on December 21, 1944. Nobody realizes they're driving over ground that one teenage American private held against an armored division for 3 hours. That's how history works. The moments that change everything fade into the landscape. But we remember. Not because Francis Curry wanted us to. He never sought the spotlight, never demanded acknowledgement, never traded on his moment of glory. We remember because his story asks a question every generation has to answer. A question that echoes across decades and demands we examine ourselves. What do you do when no one is watching? When the odds are impossible? When every instinct screams at you to run? What do you do when there's no camera to capture your courage? No crowd to witness your choice? No guarantee anyone will ever know what you sacrificed? Francis Curry showed us. You take the suicidal angle. You hold the line. You do what needs to be done. Not for applause. Not for history books. Not because you think you'll survive. You do it because in that frozen moment, when everything falls away except the raw mathematics of right and wrong, you can't live with yourself if you choose anything else. And then, if you survive, you go home. You put the bazooka down. You hang the medal in a drawer where it gathers dust alongside old tax returns and forgotten photographs. You show up for work on Monday morning, punch your time card, sit at a government desk in a fluorescent-lit office. You help the next guy fill out his paperwork. You explain VA benefits to confused veterans who don't know you once destroyed tanks with your bare hands and impossible courage. You live quietly, with dignity, never asking for recognition, never expecting the world to bow before your sacrifice. That's the real monument. Not the bronze statue frozen mid-action in Cazenovia Park. Not the renamed post office where people buy stamps without knowing whose name hangs above the door. Not the Medal of Honor citation written in formal military language that can never capture what it actually felt like to stand in that angle. The real monument is the life lived afterward. The decades of service that nobody wrote articles about. The choice, repeated every single day for 75 years, to simply be present, useful, and kind. Think about that mathematics. Francis Sherman Curry spent 3 hours holding off a Panzer advance. 3 hours of concentrated heroism that would have justified a lifetime of celebration. But he spent 75 years showing us what comes after. 75 years demonstrating that true courage isn't just standing in the suicidal angle once, it's choosing every day to serve without seeking glory, to help without demanding gratitude, to give without expecting recognition. Both mattered. Both deserve remembering. The young soldier who refused to run deserves our respect. But the old man who refused to capitalize on his heroism deserves something more, our emulation. Anyone can have one great moment. Francis Curry showed us how to have 75 years of quiet greatness. So the question passes to you now. Not whether you would hold the suicidal angle. Most of us will never face that literal choice. But whether you would make the quieter version of that choice, that test comes every day. Whether you would stay when it's easier to leave. Whether you would help when it's simpler to look away. Whether you would choose duty without recognition, service without applause, kindness without cameras. Whether you would spend your life pushing papers to help veterans instead of touring the country, telling everyone how heroic you once were. What would you do?